Following the AQA GCSE English Literature course, and studying this text would be the equivalent of 20% of your final GCSE grade. Now today we're focusing on Assessment Objective 3, which is where you need to show understanding of the relationships between texts and the contexts in which they were set and written. And what that actually means is what was going on in society and what was going on in history when the texts were set and written. So how does the background information help to show our understanding of the text? Now, 15% of your overall marks come from Assessment Objective 3. Now today, what I want you to do is you can either do it on a laptop or make notes on your phone, or you can write them down in your exercise book that we've given you. You can make notes, you can make spider diagrams, you can make your notes in any way that you want, but we'll be going through an awful lot of information and I want you to record it down because you will be using this information when we come to study the text in more detail, and you will be using it in future assessments and examinations. So, Charles Dickens, the author of this novella, A Christmas Carol, was born in 1812. Now, his father was imprisoned for being in debt, which meant that because he was a lower working class boy, he needed to work to pay off some of the debts, and his family needed extra money. So he actually worked in a blacking factory where they darkened materials. Now, Dickens was very passionate about the poor and he really wanted to do anything that he could to help them. So if you want to pause this information now, like I said, please do make some notes. You don't have to go into lots of detail, but bullet point it down or put it into a spider diagram. Now, life in Victorian England. So Queen Victoria was on the throne at the time when Charles Dickens wrote his novel. So at this time, there was a huge gap between the poor and the rich. It was a much bigger divide than it is today. And basically the contrast between the two was shocking. So if you look at that middle upper class family on the left hand side, you can see that they've got servants. You can see how opulent, how wealthy they are, and look at the room and what's in it. But on the right hand side, you can see there many people that look like they're working in a workhouse, and they're given food there, and they're all in rows and lines, and you can see how dark the room is, perhaps inferring a lack of heat. Okay, so those that were poor lived in squalor, deprivation, dirt and misery. They barely had enough money or food to survive. Now, the death rate, the child death rate, their mortality rate was extremely high, with lots of children dying in the early years. And this was due to the fact there was no healthcare. There wasn't any national health service then. If you got ill and you could not work, your whole family was at risk of death. Now, you may have been put into somewhere called the workhouse, and this was the only option that some families had, or else they would have had to have gone onto the streets and begged with many other people. But in the workhouse, they would at least be fed and housed and have a roof over their head. So it was really just living to survive and working to survive. But however often the workhouses, families were split up, the men and women were put into separate places, and often the conditions were no better. As you can see here, a picture of deprivation, of people and families living on the streets, and you can see they're huddled together, and it's dark and dingy and dirty. Now, those that were rich, though, lived in the opposite way. They had enormous houses, luxury clothes and servants. But also the rich in Victorian time, the majority of them took very little interest in helping the poor. They felt that it wasn't their plight. They didn't feel that they had to. And they felt that poverty was the fault of the poor, or it was a punishment, or something that could be avoided, that they could work more, but they just couldn't empathise with their position at all. Okay, if you do want to stop the clip here, like I said, feel free just to make some notes. Now, if you have a look at the picture image here, you can see how wealthy this family are in comparison to the pictures that we've seen previously. Now, the workhouses, these were only places where people who were too poor to survive could get help, but the conditions in them, some feel, they were made deliberately harsh in order to discourage people from having to go there. Okay, so a little bit now about the Industrial Revolution and what was going on in history at that time. So, from 1780, factory owners in Britain began to use coal-fired steam engines to power machines in big factories, which brought great fortune. So the transition from the traditional farming methods to machinery led to an industrial revolution. So people flocked from the countryside to the cities. So London's population between 1800 and 1900 went from 1 million to 6 million people. Obviously, that led to overcrowding and hunger, disease and crime. There was also no proper drainage or sewerage systems for people to go to the toilet, so many diseases occurred. Many families had to share a tap or a toilet. But really, the children suffered the most at this time. They were exploited by factory owners who forced them to work long hours in extremely dangerous conditions. Now, for charity, the Industrial Revolution led to a gap between the rich and the poor, with many struggling to survive, relying on the generosity of those better off than themselves. Now, some philanthropists were keen to enhance the life of workers. So, for example, here in Birmingham, Cadbury's tried to provide quality homes and improve lifestyles of work at their factory in Bournville. So this is where you've got the BVT, the Bournville Trust. And this is where there are some really nice houses where people live. And that was based on the back of what Cadbury's, they were Quakers, that's what they did. Please feel free to Google or to use a dictionary to search the word philanthropist to see what it means. So the education, now Dickens truly believed that of the importance in education and that education could lead you out of poverty. So as part of his campaign against the treatment of the poor, Dickens worked with a friend called Angela Burdett Coutts. So in 1840, Dickens and Coutts became involved in the ragged schools, and their aim was to provide poor children with a basic education. Now, religion, well, this is, I find, quite shocking because people that are Christians are meant to love one another and they're also meant to support one another. Christianity was a strong influence in Victorian Britain, especially amongst the middle and upper classes. And good Christians believed in a strict moral code. So they went to church regularly, they avoided alcohol, and they didn't really have sexual relationships outside of marriage. But Dickens' view on Christianity was different. He believed that to be a good Christian, you should seek out opportunities to do good deeds for other people. So there's a key term now. If you can use these sort of key terms, then you will get into the higher GCSE bracket of a level 6 and above. So he talks about something called Sabbatarianism. This is where people spent Sunday going to church and resting. Now, Dickens was opposed to this because it meant that working poorer people were denied any enjoyment on their one day off because everything was shut. So they could go to church and they could rest, but what we found is poorer people didn't even have ovens at home. So they often went to the bakers and gave them a small amount of money for their food to be cooked and for it to be hot. But what this means is Sabbatarianism meant that people couldn't get a hot meal on Sundays because the bakers were shut. So really it was a vicious cycle. So, ladies and gents, to summarise, Dickens felt very strongly about the gap between the rich and poor, and really he wrote the novella A Christmas Carol to try and highlight the difference in that class system, the lower classes versus the middle and upper classes, because he wanted to make people think differently about their actions. And this is one of the huge themes and the crux of the plot of A Christmas Carol. So the last task I would like you to do after writing those copious amounts of notes is to write about why do you think he chose to set his novella at Christmas time? And what does Christmas mean in our society? Now, you may want to look it up, what Christmas means to Christians in society. But why did he choose to set his book at the specific time of Christmas? So, ladies and gents, so I want you to make all of those notes, either bullet point it or create spider diagrams. And I would like you to answer that question, please, in your exercise books. I look forward to next week going over an exam question with you, which would represent your 20% of your final GCSE. Okay, have a lovely week. Bye-bye.